when we're struggling with money, it takes us to the margins. It takes us often into isolation, into, kind of withdrawing from community. And if there's one place that, we can actually be welcomed back into community, the church is a wonderful place for that.
One of the big questions that I've received in doing that research around what are the issues on like Gen Zs and millennials' minds is like who can I trust or turn to for financial wisdom?
If we don't do that, people get shaped and discipled by general consumerism, because we live in a world that we're all shaped by consumerism every day. Like, we have adverts and we're told that we need more, and we're all being shaped with our money.
Hey there, and welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm your host, Caleb, and I'm so glad that you've joined with us here today. Before we get into this conversation, if this is your first time joining, thanks so much for tuning in. This is a podcast where we have gospel-centered conversations with people who love Jesus and basically explore and hear some stories on how Christians engage within this current cultural moment. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. With that said, I'm so excited for you guys to hear this conversation. So let's jump into it together. Well, I'm joined here with a guest from an organization that's formerly been known as Christians Against Poverty Australia, or some may know it as CAP Australia, which is now known as Hope Economy. And I'm joined here with the CEO of Hope Economy, Rosie Kendall. Welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. How are you going?
Good. Thank you, Caleb. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to the conversation, particularly because it's around money and finances. And funny enough, I did some research with my audience probably mid last year. It was really broad to find out what are the pressing issues on people's minds and hearts. And one of the top three was like finances. And
interesting.
Yeah, super fascinating. And it was just like, it was the interest wasn't like a positive interest. It was like around anxiety and how we as Christians should be managing finances, how we should be living in a culture where it just seems really hopeless. To try get a foot ahead or try create some sort of financial security. And I know you right in this space. So really looking forward to having a conversation.
It's great context. Thanks, Caleb. I mean, I could even just riff off the back of that and say, we all have to spend money, and so it's one of those things that we all have as a human condition that we have, we can't get away from the fact that we use money. So it's inevitably something that we all need to think about.
Right. So how do you frame like approaching this topic? Actually, let's take a step back first. For people who may not know who you are and what you do, give us some insight into Hope Economy, a bit of its history and why it exists.
Yeah, so as you said at the start of up until this point, we've been known as Christians Against Poverty, CAP Australia, so launched here in Australia in the year 2000, so 26 years ago. We have a mission to inspire and equip God's people, Christians, to walk alongside those in financial distress. And we want to do that in an authentic way that we can share our faith and show the love of Jesus as we do that. And for us, that has looked like, and kind of really for us, we're really leaning into this space of partnering with churches. How do we help the church, individual churches work out what it looks like to have a good, healthy relationship with money, and to actually walk alongside people that are currently walking through journeys of financial struggle in isolation. I'm sure this will come out, as we talk through different topics and subjects, but when we're struggling with money, it takes us to the margins. It takes us often into isolation, into, kind of withdrawing from community. And if there's one place that, we can actually be welcomed back into community, the church is a wonderful place for that. And so we do many different things really within that space of equipping and inspiring the church, really with lots of things around money and walking alongside people that are financially vulnerable.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, the work that you guys do, and I think it's so needed, especially because I feel like finances is like, it's something that, like you mentioned, you can't do much without money. So it impacts every person's life. Yet, especially in churches, maybe there's not as much education around it as there should be. And yeah, maybe that is why it's important to be talking about it, because like you mentioned, people who are in financial struggle are pushed to the margins. There is this isolation from community, and we know like community is so important to flourishing and to be able to just function in society. So yeah, maybe you can unpack that a bit. Why is financial struggle like often associated with isolation or leads to that place?
Yeah, so much in what you just said. I think that there's something, especially, let's talk Australian culture for a second, and the kind of where and how we live, and I think probably exacerbated by lots of things like social media, and we live fairly public lives, lots of people, and ultimately we also live in a backdrop where Australia is the lucky country, and we're all maybe have got an understanding or a fundamental belief that sits under lots of things that we should have enough. We're a very wealthy country, and therefore if we've not got enough, or we've not got as much as the kind of perceived understanding of what someone else has, then we often will think that that's our fault, when actually our experience would tell us that most people that are walking through financial difficulty often have finances. While we like to think we're in control of our financial situation, actually we're often the kind of a result of our circumstances. It might be our jobs, it might be our family history, it might be going through a relationship breakdown, it might be illness, it could be many and different things that kind of happen to us, and depending on the community that is around us, often depends on how well we would go through that situation. And so I think that shame ultimately stops people from telling people that they're having problems with money, because we feel like we should be doing okay. And I also think that outside of a church context, most of our community and socialization also costs money. So, you need a car, and you need petrol, and we eat out, and we go to cafes, and we go to the movies. And so I think that doesn't help either, in that ultimately, if someone's going through a difficult financial time, often it is, the sacrifices of not eating out, not doing things maybe to entertain the kids, etc. And so it kind of moves you both at a shame level towards isolation, but actually just on a practical, I want to save fuel, and I don't want to spend money doing things that would usually draw me back into community. So I think between those two things, I think that it does just draw people into isolation. And we know, as you said, that we do, as humans, we don't do well in isolation. We're created for community.
Right. So I'm curious then, how do you enter into that tension that people may be experiencing, and sort of coach them through, or what tools would you give them? Because like a few really practical things that you said is like our communities are established around going out, or having a coffee, or fuel to get there, or public transport. And just this past week, I noticed how like fuel went from $1.90 to $2.70, like huge. 80-cent jump, which is massive. So it's like,
it is.
How do people, or how should we be thinking of engaging in community when there's these two sort of groups, people who they're not thinking about the increase of costs or even how much something's going to cost. But then there's people who have it on their mind because, driving 30 minutes to catch a friend to have a coffee is actually going to potentially put some stress on the rest of their week. Do you have an answer to that?
Well, I think that, again, it comes to having conversation. One of the things that you talked about earlier, even within a church context, but I think this is true outside, we don't talk about money openly. We might talk about, cost of fuel going up, for example, and that being, we do talk about those things. But in terms of how it affects us personally, we don't often talk about that. And so I think that the invitation is that we, in a healthy community, we would be talking about money much more often, and we would be aware of people's needs much more freely and openly. I think if we were able to know that we had a friend that was struggling and we could meet them for coffee and we could pay for them to have a coffee, or we could open our home and have a family around for a meal that we know is struggling. I know myself from relationship and periods of time when we've not had a lot, being invited to someone's home and not having to pay for a full meal for a family of 5 is a big, it's a big blessing. And so ultimately, if we go back to our new name of Hope Economy, there's a real vision within this new name for us that if at the root of economy and the word economy is household, and for churches, Paul often a couple of times through scripture kind of describes the church as God's household, and therefore there's like this vision that actually within the church community, and I don't mean that as kind of just Christians, I mean within a healthy Christian community that's part of the fabric of its own community, that we would see ourselves as a household that provides for one another. And to provide for one another, ultimately, we have to know each other's needs. And that means that, kind of at a point in our history when less of us are going to church than ever before, when less of us are talking to our neighbours than ever before, when we're not kind of aware of the needs of the people around us, it means it's really difficult to respond in the way that we're talking about. And so there is, in my opinion, and kind of biased because we talk about this often within our own team and the work that we're doing, that actually knowing the needs of the people around us is often the first step to being able to do anything.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's huge. I think it's really important. Part of like what I've done in the past is I've done some study and research in social like impact measurement, particularly around like subjective well-being. So it's understanding before you enter into a community to affect sustainable and proper change, you actually have to understand like what are the issues that they're struggling with. So you could go into a community in Africa and be like, there's no water here, and go just be like, we're going to drill down a well and give this community water. But in reality, the issue could be a lot deeper than that. And if you haven't understood that it's actually not necessarily water, it's like their ability to sell their crops or things like that, then you're gonna not help that community flourish and actually feel like they can have this contribution. So it's like something that I've been thinking of is like how do we understand what the needs of our communities are if people aren't sharing what their struggles are or what their needs are? Is that just going to friends or where we find ourselves with the question out of curiosity? Or is there a more tactful way that we can go about that to understand, this is where we're living, these are the needs, without just going in and drilling a well because that's what we think is going to solve the issue.
Just so much there. Once again, I'll maybe start by saying I think that so one of the things that we do is train church-based volunteers to become what we call a money mentor. And as part of that process, it's become really important to us that we sit down with people and don't make presumptions about what they've come to us for assistance or help with, in that, they've reached out for help because they're struggling with their finances, but often it's so many other things that are affecting their situation, that money is just one of many things. And sometimes when you're outside a situation, you can make an assumption about what someone's goal might be or what it is that they're actually needing help with. But yeah, it's really important in terms of the way that we train our volunteers is to ask the right questions to get to exactly what you're talking about, it being, or what is it that what is it that you want? And ultimately, when we're meeting with someone and they're able to identify their own goals, the ability for them to walk together through that process to get to a place where they're feeling better about their situation is often because they're working towards the things that are causing them the most stress. And sometimes they can be the most unusual things. A story comes to mind where I remember us having a conversation with someone who was in a really difficult financial situation, but the thing that was causing them most stress was that they'd got an estranged relationship with a daughter. And, it's kind of like, we're here to help you with your financial situation and walk through that. But if that's the thing that's causing you most upset, how can we pray about that? How can we help with that situation? I think as part of what you said too, what are the small steps? I would also say, that was all kind of within this context of money mentoring. For those of us that aren't doing that, I actually think that there's a big part for us in slowing down. I often use the picture of us walking into a supermarket and we're often so busy, me included, so this doesn't come with judgment. I'm going in, I'm buying milk and I've got 3 kids but actually, how good are we at stopping before we go into a situation like that and saying, God, show me the person in this supermarket that's struggling, and really inviting God to use our margin. And I could talk about that within our financial situations too, in that, I think for those of us that feel like we have enough, we have a call to look at our margin, whether that be our time or be our money, and say, God, help me. Such a biblical, again, I could go deep, like in terms of our the biblical story of margin and kind of cleaving and leaving for the widow and the orphan. And I think it's important that we leave that space, and I don't think we're very good at that, actually, me included. And so, I don't know whether there's one thing that will help us to see the need. But I do think that us slowing down and making sure that we are asking the right questions to not assume what someone is struggling with most would help. And maybe the other thing that just comes to mind is that, especially within church context, and we started talking about this at the beginning, we don't talk about money enough. And so money becomes this kind of, we only really know how to talk about tithing and generosity or giving to a specific project. We don't really talk about what we do with the rest of our money, and how do we glorify God, and how do we see discipleship with our whole financial resources and time that God has given us. And I think that if we could talk about that more, maybe it would be easier when people are struggling to also talk about it, because it would be less of a niche or taboo thing, because we don't talk about it enough.
Yeah. And do you think we don't talk about it enough because it's become such an identity thing? Like your value, you mentioned that it's like attached to shame. So is that a part of the reason that we don't want to feel shame? Or on the other side is like, we don't want people to judge us whether we have a lot or a little?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we would talk about a lot is that our money and the way that we spend our money actually represents what we value. And
Mm,
so um, I don't think we give that enough time and attention. So, the things, if I was to show you my banking app now and show you all the things that I've spent in the last week, it would reveal a lot about the
mm,
things that I value. And therefore, when we're in church situations, it becomes hard maybe for people to feel that they can talk about their spending openly because they feel like they're going to be judged on the things that they spend money
mm,
on. But I think that it's just a bit of a double-edged sword in that because we don't talk about it, we don't get much teaching or discipleship on it either.
mm,
But maybe there's also this kind of sense of shame of thinking, well, I've got myself into a situation, and we probably all could make better financial decisions all the time. And maybe going back to something I said really earlier, actually, I think that most of our financial situations, aren't. It's not because we're in control. It's because of our
yeah.
generational history and what we've been given, and maybe our parents' wealth, or the
Mm,
jobs that we've fallen into, and how well or poorly we're paid in those situations. And so I think we're in much less control than we think we are. Maybe
mm,
that's one thing. But actually, when we are in trouble or starting to struggle, it's probably at that point that we start blaming ourselves and thinking it's
mm,
our fault.
mm,
And I think I think that's totally natural and normal. But those of us that are having conversations with someone that is struggling, the best thing that we can do is kind of take all shame away, and kind of
mm.
bring as much understanding to that as possible.
Yeah. And I can imagine as well the solution isn't necessarily um, solving all their problems. You sort of want to empower them to be able to see that, yeah, there's steps that they can take, or um, shifts that they can make to, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like being financially free or having a better financial well-being. Um,
Mm.
is that right? Or is it, yeah, because that's a very real thing. If someone is like struggling financially and has this anxiety that they living just paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
I feel like most Gen Zs and millennials have that as, I think it's like 50% of them are living paycheck to paycheck. So it's a very real thing. How do you enter into that and have that conversation around wanting to hear them, but then not wanting to um, be a crutch for them either?
Yeah, and I think that this is something that people find really difficult, which, ultimately Hope Economy exists to help people grapple with these kind of questions. How do I help someone without causing more pain?
Mm,
We've got, as Christians, not a wonderful history behind us of causing, with the best of intentions, causing people more pain by actually
right.
doing too much. So I think in this context, the way that we approach it is to, as I said before, kind of what is it that this person, our new friend, is wanting to achieve? What is it that's actually causing them problems? And often,
Mm,
um, being in a financial hardship situation. So, actually being in a situation that is highly stressful. We've got bills coming in that we can't afford. The overwhelm is normally the thing that's kind of debilitating us. And
mm,
so, having someone, a physical person, stepping into that situation and being able to say, it's okay, there will be a solution,
mm,
and to bring a sense of, taking away that shame and
mm,
judgment and showing grace into that situation. One can be transformative all on its own. But then it's having someone to come alongside you and help you identify what the next step is, in that we all, as individuals, can do a next step. So maybe it's calling our utility company to get a hardship arrangement in place. Maybe it's filling in the bit of paperwork that someone sent us that we've just not been able to get around. Normally, in a situation where someone's overwhelmed, they've probably got 10, 15, 20 of those small steps that have kind of just, ballooned out. Again, I think of various different stories, even over the last 12 months, of a money mentor sitting with someone and just sitting next to them while they're making a phone call. And so you might think, well, they could have made that phone call on their own, but actually the physical presence of having someone to sit there and just be there when you're making those steps actually are transformational. And so I think that when you're in a period of overwhelm, which not everyone is, that might be if you're in a situation where you're living paycheck to paycheck, you might not yet be in that overwhelmed situation. But if you're in an overwhelmed situation, having someone to come alongside you and to help you work out what the next best step is, and to just be there with you without doing it for you. So, we're not advocating that someone's coming in and they're going to do the whole thing for you. They're just going to be there, is very, very powerful.
Right. And is that sort of the idea behind Hope Economy, is having access to people who understand the system and know how to take those next steps?
Yeah, so we do a few things at Hope Economy. One of them is church partnership and money discipleship, and how do we deepen our own conviction with how we spend our own money. We've touched on the edges of some of that in terms of how do I allow Jesus to disciple me with how I use my money? That's one thing, and ultimately the goal of that is us considering people in the margins, and how do I use my time and my resources to mean that people who are currently struggling on their own aren't doing that. But one of the other things that we do alongside that is train frontline volunteers to be money mentors. And so, for people that are maybe in the community and don't know who to turn to, they can go onto our website and they can send us an inquiry, and we connect them with a money mentor based in a church. And a money mentor is essentially trained to do everything that we've just talked about, encourage people to talk about their money. We all have a money story, and so we encourage them to think about, how is it that they got here? Often it is, how did my parents use money? What kind of money was around when I was growing up? Well, how do my friends use money? And really stepping people through from that point to looking at really practical things like a budget and where's money going and who do we owe money to, and helping people really, as I said before, make what's the next step and being alongside someone as they do that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I can see how that creates like a healthy awareness around money and finances, and actually understanding what comes in and what goes out, which maybe lots of people take for granted as well. But it's something that's like, if you're not aware of it, like you mentioned, have a look at someone's bank account and then it actually shows. But I'd say almost certainly not many people are aware of their bank account if they're not having a look. It's so easy just to take your phone and tap. And
totally. We're in a bit of a scary time in terms of how easy it is to access money and to spend money, for sure. Yeah. And so,
No, please do share. What does that look like in this time? It is a scary time, but not many people would say it's scary. People would be like, no, it's so efficient and productive, and I don't even have to think. I can just take my phone or my watch, and it's.
Yeah, I think it becomes scary in the realm of, like, if we go back to the discipleship conversation. So if we see our money as a tool to be used for the glory of God, big comment. But if we
Yeah.
see that everything that we have is how do I become more like Jesus, and how do I bring his good to the people and around me, we should therefore have a real intentionality about how we're spending our money. And the fact that we can spend money without intention, which is ultimately exactly what you just talked about, kind of we can use our credit card. I mean, I've got my cards on my phone. It's so easy to kind of tap and go. We have lost our kind of connection to being intentional with our money. And I think that what for us as Christians, that should bother us. That doesn't mean that, kind of we shouldn't have our credit cards on our phone. It just means that we might need to build some habits into our lives to, again, slow us down, to have an ability to critically assess what am I spending my money on? What is that reflecting about my heart condition? And what is it? Am I trying to fulfill needs in me from anything other than my walk with Jesus? Or am I using my money to build community, build family, build church, build, kind of, and there's no right or wrong answers with that. It's not, kind of Jesus talks about money a lot, but he doesn't give us a formula. He doesn't give you a budget and say, he asks questions, and maybe, that's why he gave us parables and stories, because I think that helps us to work out for ourselves how we, in our own context, in the things that God has laid on our heart, how do we reflect our relationship with Jesus with the things that we have? And so, I think being intentional is something as Christians that we could really do better.
Yeah. How should Jesus reshape then how we live with money as Christians?
So, I think that ultimately, as we get to know Jesus, whether we've known him for a day or a week or years, our journey ultimately should be a discipleship journey in which we're becoming more like him. And as we've talked about already, it's very difficult to not see how that then affects our money. And so I think Jesus gives us an invitation with our money to say, how can we use our money to reflect the values of his kingdom? And I think that money is a very interesting thing with our discipleship, because it's very practical in that, a lot of our discipleship journey can be theoretical, whereas we have an ability with our money to both look, say, we were talking about our bank accounts and our, banking app, getting it up and looking and going, okay, well, where am I spending my money and what is that telling me? But we also have an opportunity to make informed decisions moving forward. So we would talk about that, we're able to both diagnose the problem by looking at it, but we're also able to say, well, I can put a treatment plan in place for that. Like, I could be more generous. I could put more money in my budget so that I have some margin to invite someone round for dinner, or pay for someone's groceries in the supermarket when I see that they're struggling. We're actually able to make informed decisions that are very practical. And so therefore, kind of our opportunity, I think, with discipleship and money is that we have a very practical way to work that out, which I think is kind of exciting. There's something, it's not, I have an actual practical invitation to work out my discipleship, which I think is really great.
Yeah, it's I agree. It's brilliant. I'd love to hear your thoughts around how you approach a scarcity mindset, and the impact that does have on our discipleship and our walk with Jesus.
So we're all guilty of feeling like there's not enough. We and I think that ultimately we live in a world that tells us that. Especially, in our Australian context, we are told that we always need more, and there isn't enough to go around. And so we live in this ecosystem that's what we're told. And yet, when we read the Bible and get to know Jesus, we have a different reality told to us. That is that God is an abundant God and there is enough for all. And therefore, I think for us to be able to truly grapple with some of the things that we've talked about today about being more generous, being able to reflect God with how we are spending, we need to recognize that God is an abundant God and there is enough. And actually, where we recognize and see, and, kind of our ministry as well as overseas would tell us that there are many, many, many people that do not have enough. And the reason that they do not have enough is because there are those of us that have too much. And so God is actually inviting us to work out how we, how can we see God as a God that is, has provided enough for all and invited us to distribute that fairly. And that can be a bit of an overwhelming thought, to be honest. Like how do I, I can't redistribute the whole world's wealth, and we can't ultimately as individuals, but we can be reflective of that in our own families and our own communities and recognize that God will always provide for us and that our security can be wholly and truly in Him, and we do not need to build up wealth on earth to build our security. And if we can live out of that, I think that we're also able to lean into ideas like simplicity, not because I think God calls us to live simply, but I think He calls us to lead generous, hospitable lives. And to lead generous, hospitable lives, that often means that we need to work out what we actually need and what we don't need, which, kind of journey towards simplicity, I think is really healthy and good for us as a discipleship practice.
Yeah, I agree. I think it also does something like good for the heart, which I suppose is that whole discipleship journey as well, that it redirects your desires and affections toward Jesus as opposed to holding things onto for yourself. Just maybe this is a bit of a curveball, but so redistributing wealth, if someone is, say, trading on the stock market or things like that, where you need wealth to make, you need money to make more money, how do you approach that in that discipleship conversation where it's immediately it doesn't look like I'm being generous, but potentially 5 years down the line, what do you know what I'm sort of asking?
I do. I think it's tricky. So I would never walk into a situation, and I think we need to be really careful not to, it'd be really easy to be maybe judgmental or kind of walk into a situation like that and be like, oh, you can't do that. Maybe that goes back to my, our biblical narrative and story that I don't think Jesus gives us a platform of saying whether that's right or wrong. And so therefore I would encourage us all to consistently be asking ourselves the questions of why, and be trying to ask ourselves our own heart condition. I think there are definitely situations in which we can tell ourselves that we will be generous when. I think that can be a dangerous thing to say. In that, it's kind of like, oh, well, I don't have enough now to be generous. And I think that God cultivates generosity in us. So I think that, if we think that we're not as generous as maybe we should be, I think God invites us to do small things, and that actually grows generosity. And so if we're in a situation where, we're currently not giving any of our money away, and yet in our mind we think, well, in 5 years' time, I'm going to give $100,000 away. I actually think someone's going to find that really, really difficult, almost impossible.
Yeah.
So because actually we're going to be in the small steps, it's where we build our faith and our generosity muscle. And so I would encourage people to be thinking about stretching that muscle slowly over time rather than having a mentality of, well, kind of when I've got more, because I'm not sure that that's always helpful. But in terms of your specific question, I honestly don't have a good answer for that in terms of should that be good or should it not. I think that our heart condition and how we're actually using what we have now to reflect Jesus would be the questions that I would want, could ask each other in that kind of situation.
That's brilliant. Do you mind unpacking just how Christians can take those smaller steps toward generosity a bit more? What does that look like, or what questions should we be asking ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I just said, small steps are helpful. I was trying to think about where we're at now and asking what is the next small step that I could take to be more generous. So we talked about simplicity, like where in my current spending could I cut back to mean that I had more margin, or where could I cut back to mean that I could be more generous? I think that having margin in our budget is really helpful as an intent to, how do we look for opportunities to be generous. I also think that we can consider where our money goes to from a giving perspective. So, one of the things that maybe we're more familiar with talking about is giving, tithing to church or giving to a charity. And I think that one thing that can help us is having real intentionality again around that giving, in that often most of our giving is a bit kind of at a distance. I give money, that makes me feel good, and I move on. Having an intentionality with that giving, so it becomes that I've got a relationship with that organisation that I give money to, and I actually know what they're doing with my money, and we're doing it together. And as well as with our church, that we give money to our churches, but ultimately, do we feel like we're in this together and we're building a household and we're building community? And if we're not in the habit of giving regularly, sometimes I think that we can give, maybe we assess our generosity by our ad hoc giving. And I think that ad hoc giving is great, but actually in terms of a discipleship mechanism, signing up for regular giving is one of the best things that we can do, whether that be to our church or an organisation, because it's like a commitment. It's we're not having to think about that. We're saying, actually, this is something that I'm building into my budget on a regular basis. And then maybe one of the other things for people to be asking themselves and considering is, actually, how do I spend my money, and what, do I make ethical choices with what I spend my money on? Kind of where every dollar we spend ultimately has some kind of implication. Again, that can be a massive question. Where do I buy my clothes, and where do I buy my food, and where? And I think that can be, again, overwhelming. And so is there one thing that we could look at, especially in a household environment or families? Like, is there one thing that we could do differently this year, and that would be slightly more ethical than how we've done things previously? And so, I always think that there's one more thing that we can do, but often it's, let's start with one. Don't make a list of 10.
Right. Yeah. Don't get overwhelmed. It's like, how do you eat an elephant?
That's it. One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. So you mentioned, like, thinking about it in families. I'm sure we've got people who have kids listening to this. What do you have some practical tools or thoughts that parents can be engaging their children with to actually be discipling their children in being good financial stewards? Obviously, we want to set a good example in ourselves, and bring them into that conversation. But yeah, how do we train and teach our children in this?
I mean, I think that's a whole nother podcast and conversation
Yes,
for another
I have
day.
to get you back on. Yeah.
Which is fine. I'm happy
Cool.
to. But ultimately, I mean, I would start by saying that talking about money is something we don't do enough in our household. So actually, most of us would say that we grew up in households where we didn't really talk about money. And so even just destigmatizing talking about money, I think, is a wonderful thing.
How does that look like? Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, go on.
Yeah. Just in terms of
I think just being, talking about mortgages and food and kind of costs of things and, kind of take this recent example that we touched on earlier about the increase in fuel prices, not that we want to be, we want to stay away from that being a fear conversation with our children, but do they know that those things are variable? Do they know, and then as it translates with them, kind of, do they get pocket money and do they spend, how did they spend their money, and do we talk about that with them? Kind of one of the things that we would do with our kids is, they have pocket money. What are you going to spend your pocket money on? And just really, kind of, we could give pocket money, or we could actually have intentional conversations with them to help them steward that money. And I think that anything that we can do to talk about that is really helpful. We actually at Hope Economy have some resources that families can use too, that if you were to get onto our website, there's kind of conversation starters, I think, that you can have in terms of your family. So things like, how do we spend our money and where does it go? And they could be really simple things like, where do we buy our products from, and let's have a conversation about that. And, are there good companies that you can do that from, and are there bad companies that you can do, what are the implications of our spending? And having conversations about those things can be really helpful, I think. I think that the other thing I would say, just to kind of, at a top level, is talking to our kids about their own giving and their own generosity, again, in terms of something that's going to really be a discipleship journey, is to work out, okay, well, if I get $2 a week, is there any of that I could give away? And where am I going to give that to, and how am I going to make decisions around where that goes? And helping our kids have conversations about where it's going to go. How are you going to make a decision? What are you passionate about? What is it that God's put in uniquely within you as a passion, and how and where can be generous?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much for that. I think it is helpful, and super interested in having another conversation around that, because I think that's an important one. With one of the big questions that I've received in doing that research around just what are the issues on Gen Zs and millennials' minds, is who can I trust or turn to for financial wisdom? Because I think that's there's anxiety on all this pressure, and it seems like they're never going to get a foot ahead in life because there's this financial burden, and it's constantly on their mind. And like you mentioned as well, in our culture, we sort of are in a very lucky country. So it's of course we should be living a good life. And but then it's well, it's not really spoken about. I remember actually when I was 18, I saved up my first, I don't know what it was. It was a big figure for me. I think it was $2,000 or $5,000. And I was really proud of that. And I went to someone in my church who I thought, well, they're a businessman. And I was hey, I want to be a good steward of this money. how should I use it or approach it? And they said, like, I don't know. You should go figure it out. And I was just left like
Not
hopeless.
a helpful yeah,
not
totally.
not helpful,
Not helpful.
At all. So it's like for the next 10 years, I was like, okay, how do I have financial wisdom? Like if people in my church who seem like they've got it together aren't inputting into me, do I go to YouTube or like where can I go? It's a big question, but sort of like who can I trust or turn to for financial
ultimately
wisdom?
that is a hole that Hope Economy is trying and wanting to try and plug, because ultimately where should you go? You should be able to go to your church for that discipleship. And I think that the church often at the moment doesn't know how to move towards that conversation either. It feels difficult. I think, we don't have a great reputation within the church of asking for money, talking about money. And so it can be a conversation that church leaders and congregations don't feel that confident in. And so kind of we've been on this big journey over the last few years to say, okay, well, within the Australian context, we think that there's a really unique opportunity for churches to have much better discipleship conversations around money, and so have put together resources for small groups and Bible teaching series that church leaders can use. And the hope would be that we can build our muscle internally in the church to be able to have better conversations when a young person comes to us and says, I've got $5,000 and I don't know how to steward this well. And I don't, my hope would be that person wouldn't turn around and say, well, you need to do this, 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 and this, but they might be able to sit with you and ask you some questions. Well, what is it that you're needing to do? What is it that God has laid on your heart? Kind of being able to ask helpful questions to help people make better, more intentional, informed decisions around our money is something that we long to see the church more confident in.
Yeah, I think that's super, super helpful. And yeah, it's something that always sticks in my mind. And then like an experience that I've spoken to a few others now, and it's like, yeah, there's that similar unfortunate experience that it's like when they've turned to the church to like figure out how do we become financial stewards of, or good stewards of our finances. How do we be generous people? There's not a good answer to it. So you left feeling this divide between like, do the rich people just get richer and the poor people just get poorer? That's like oversimplifying it, but it's like actually, I think, like you said, the church should be this place where people can ask those questions without shame, without the hindrance of I'm doing something wrong, and with the expectation that it's like I'm going to get pointed towards Jesus here.
Totally.
Let's try and be discipled.
And the problem, Caleb, is that if we don't do that, people get shaped and discipled by general consumerism, because we live in a world that we're all shaped by consumerism every day. Like we have adverts and we're told that we need more. And so, we're all being shaped with our money. And so if in the church context, we're not being actively discipled with our money, then actually what we're doing, if we use you as that example, you got $5,000 and I'm not sure what to do with it. If the church hasn't got a good answer for that, there are plenty other people outside of the church that have got a good answer for that.
Yeah.
And so I think that within the church, we need to be able to have better answers for how we disciple around that kind of conversation. Maybe just to make the point that I think if we don't, it's not like people aren't being shaped. It's not like there's like it's not like a neutral plane in which people will figure it out Jesus' way. We've got like this strong pull and lean. And I often talk about myself. I'm the CEO of Hope Economy, and I've been CEO for 9 years, and I've been around I talk about the kind of things that we've been talking about today regularly, and yet I would say on a daily basis I need reminding to bring my spending back in line with who Jesus is and who he said he is. And so it's not like this kind of set and forget with our money formation, because we live in a world that is constantly pulling us in a different direction towards security in stuff and money and consuming things. And so what we actually need is an equal and opposite pull of discipleship towards Jesus that will keep us moving towards Jesus, because otherwise there's a strong current taking us a different path.
Yeah, I think that's such a brilliant point, because, if we're not intentional and if we're not aware that we, regardless of being shaped by things around us, we're going to be shaped by something. It's just the question of like who or what are we being shaped by? Which is massive, especially like you said, in a consumer culture where we have people answering that question for us. So we don't even have to, if we're not aware, we don't even have to think of being intentional, because we'll just get told what to do, and that's a very risky place. Yeah.
And for our younger generations, they've got that voice. They need to buy a home, and they need to have a good job, and they need to, kind of and I'm not saying that those things aren't good things, but I also know that that God promises that he will provide for us and make a way. And so our culture will lean us towards fear. And that's not my experience of my relationship with Jesus, in that he actually can replace that fear with comfort in him. And that is very unique to anything that the world can offer us. And so, it requires intentional discipleship.
Yeah, brilliant. Just mindful of time, one last question is, if you had to ask a question to our audience to consider what we've been talking about, or consider how to just be better stewards of finances, and as Christians be thinking of how finances are really formative in our discipleship. What's a helpful question that we can be asking ourselves as we think of this?
Yeah, I think I said this somewhere in the middle of the things that we're talking about, but often it's good to ask ourselves at a time when we've maybe listened to a conversation like the one we've listened to today, like, what's one thing that I could do in response to this conversation? What's one thing I could do? It might be looking at my budget, or going into my phone app and looking at how I've spent my money and asking myself, how does this reflect my values? What does that tell me? It might be praying before I go into the supermarket next time and saying, God, show me someone that needs me to intentionally buy them something, or to have a conversation with. For each of us, I would hope and pray that God would put something in our heart that we could say, okay, that's the one thing I'm going to do in response to this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. For people who are either interested in the work that you're doing, maybe people listening are going through financial difficulties themselves, or they know someone who is, what would you suggest they do, or direct them towards? Yeah.
So I direct them to our website. So we have a website, hopeeconomy.org.au, and on there, all of those questions will be answered. So if you're someone that is currently feeling like you're struggling with your finances, and you think, do you know what, I would just love someone to come alongside me and have a conversation, there is a form on there on the bottom of every single page is a kind of contact form, and you can do that and be put in touch with a church that's trained and able to do that. If you're a church, or you're in a church and you're thinking, wow, I'd love to find out more about those discipleship resources or teaching resources, or how do I train to be a money mentor, all of that is found on the website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rosie, for this conversation. I think it's so good. And yeah, there's so many different paths that we could have explored for so much deeper. And I just encourage, people who are listening to go, check out Hope Economy. I'll put a link up in our episode description as well for people to find it easier. But thanks so much for your time, Rosie, and for the work that you're doing. I think it's super valuable for Christians and for the church, especially in this cultural context.
Thanks, Caleb.